This video is an educational documentary based on publicly available records, court documents, and official reports. Hi friends, my name is Jake, and today I'm going to be talking about 10 darkest murder cases from Australia with insane twists. Case 1. Carl Anthony Williams. The story of Carl Anthony Williams is one of ambition, paranoia, and a violent underworld that consumed Melbourne at the turn of the millennium. To the public, he became a symbol of the city's most notorious criminal era. To those who knew him, he was a man who believed power was the only form of protection, and fear was the currency that kept him alive. This is the rise and fall of a figure who stood at the center of what would later be known as the Melbourne Gangland conflict. Born on October 13, 1970, in Victoria, Australia, Carl Williams grew up in Melbourne's western suburbs. He left school early and drifted through a series of laboring jobs, never establishing a stable career. Friends described him as street smart, competitive, and intensely focused on money and reputation. His early years showed no clear path toward the level of notoriety he would later reach, but the foundations were quietly forming. Williams's personal life was unstable. He married Roberta Murciecka, herself later convicted on drug-related charges, and together they had one daughter. Financial ventures came and went, including a children's clothing business that ultimately failed. Behind the scenes, Williams was becoming increasingly involved in illegal trade, particularly large-scale drug distribution. This underground income would become both his rise and his downfall. The turning point came in October 1999, on Williams' 29th birthday. During a dispute over money, he was shot in the abdomen by Jason Moran. Although he survived, the incident permanently altered his mindset. From that moment forward, Williams became convinced that retaliation was not optional but necessary. This single event ignited a long and bloody cycle of revenge that would define the next several years of Melbourne's criminal landscape. As tensions escalated, Williams began surrounding himself with individuals willing to carry out violent tasks in exchange for payment, protection, or loyalty. He positioned himself as an organizer rather than a direct participant, distancing himself physically while maintaining control behind the scenes. This approach allowed him to operate while attempting to shield himself from immediate legal consequences. Between 2000 and 2004, a series of targeted attacks shocked the city. Mark Moran was killed outside his home in 2000. Jason Moran was later targeted in 2003 while sitting in a vehicle near a children's football clinic, an event that horrified the public due to the location and witnesses nearby. These incidents intensified media attention and police pressure, while fear spread through both criminal circles and the broader community. That same year, Michael Marshall was killed outside his South Yarra home, an incident that drew particular outrage due to the presence of his young child nearby. Not long after, Mark Malia was killed, his remains later discovered in a stormwater drain. Each case added another layer to the expanding investigation, though many details remained suppressed by court orders at the time. The violence reached another peak in March 2004 when Lewis Moran was killed inside a Brunswick club. By this stage, the pattern was undeniable. Melbourne was experiencing an unprecedented series of underworld eliminations, and law enforcement launched specialized task forces to dismantle the networks involved. Williams, once confident in his control, was now under constant surveillance. Behind closed doors, alliances began to crumble. Associates who once benefited from Williams' protection started cooperating with authorities. Loyalty weakened as pressure increased, and the so-called code of silence began to fracture. For a man who relied heavily on fear and control, this shift marked the beginning of the end. In 2007, Williams made a dramatic move. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts related to the deaths of Lewis Moran, Jason Moran, and Mark Malia, as well as conspiracy involving another rival figure. The plea was part of an agreement that spared the court years of lengthy trials and saved millions in public resources. However, it also confirmed what many already suspected. Williams had been orchestrating violence rather than merely reacting to it. During sentencing, the court emphasized the broader impact of his actions. These were not isolated incidents but coordinated decisions that fueled widespread fear across the city. The judge described Williams as someone who operated from the top of the chain, directing others while attempting to insulate himself from responsibility. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 35 years, meaning he would be elderly before even being considered for release. Despite the severity of the sentence, Williams continued to seek attention. He gave statements, displayed defiance in court, and appeared unmoved by the consequences. Observers noted a lack of genuine remorse, interpreting his behavior as frustration at losing control rather than regret for the harm caused. While incarcerated at Barwon Prison, Williams lived in the high-security unit. Though removed from the streets, his reputation followed him inside. In April 2010, while still serving his sentence, Williams suffered a fatal head injury during an altercation with another inmate. His death marked a grim conclusion to a life defined by conflict and control. The aftermath raised new questions. Speculation emerged regarding internal prison tensions and whether Williams' past actions made him a target. His funeral was held quietly, and reports later noted that his grave remained unmarked for some time, a stark contrast to the public notoriety he once commanded. In the years since, Williams' story has been revisited through documentaries, television dramas, and investigative reporting. To some, he became a cautionary tale about ego and retaliation. To others, he represented a dark chapter in Melbourne's history, one that revealed how quickly violence can spiral when fear replaces restraint. The Melbourne gangland era left lasting scars. Communities were shaken, families were shattered, and public trust was tested. While law enforcement ultimately dismantled many of the networks involved, the cost was measured in lives lost and years of instability. Williams was not the only figure involved, but he became the face most associated with that turbulent time. In the end, Carl Williams did not outsmart time, the courts, or the consequences of his choices. His belief that control could guarantee safety proved false. The same system of fear he helped build ultimately offered no protection. His story serves as a reminder that power gained through intimidation is fragile, and violence, once unleashed, rarely remains contained. Case 2. Robert Joe Wagner. The case known as the Snowtown murders remains one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Australian history, not only because of the number of victims involved, but because of how long the crimes went undetected and how ordinary the perpetrators appeared to those around them. This story unfolds over nearly a decade and reveals how manipulation, obsession, and unchecked beliefs can lead to extreme outcomes. When the truth finally emerged in 1999, it shocked an entire nation and left a small rural town forever associated with tragedy. At the center of this case was Robert Joe Wagner, born on November 28, 1971, in Parramatta, New South Wales. Wagner would later be convicted for his role in 10 unlawful deaths connected to the Snowtown investigation and sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of release. However, Wagner was not acting alone. His involvement was shaped and guided by a dominant figure who influenced nearly every aspect of the crimes. That figure was John Justin Bunting, widely described in court findings as the central organizer and ideological driver behind the group. Bunting held extreme views and cultivated a belief system that framed his actions as justified punishment against those he personally judged as immoral. These beliefs were not supported by evidence or law, yet they became the foundation for a series of calculated acts carried out over several years. The crimes associated with the Snowtown case occurred between 1992 and 1999 across multiple locations in South Australia. Although the name Snowtown became permanently linked to the investigation, most of the incidents took place in suburban areas near Adelaide. The town itself was only connected late in the timeline, when a rented former bank building was used to conceal evidence. Victims were not selected through any formal pattern recognized by investigators. Instead, court records showed that individuals were targeted based on rumors, personal grudges, or perceived behaviors that Bunting viewed as unacceptable. Some victims were friends, acquaintances, or relatives of the offenders, while others were drawn in after brief social contact. This unpredictability made the crimes difficult to detect and allowed them to continue unnoticed. The group included several individuals who played different roles over time. Robert Wagner became one of Bunting's closest associates and actively participated in multiple offenses. Mark Hayden later admitted to helping conceal evidence, while James Vlasakis eventually cooperated with authorities and provided crucial testimony. The dynamics within the group were built on fear, loyalty, and psychological control rather than equal partnership. For years, families reported missing loved ones, often receiving little immediate response because there were no obvious signs of wrongdoing. Some victims were never formally reported missing, which further delayed connections between the cases. It was only after inconsistencies surrounding the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden raised suspicions that investigators began to uncover links between multiple individuals. The turning point came on May 20th, 1999, when police searched a disused bank building in Snowtown. What they discovered inside confirmed long-standing fears that a much larger series of crimes had taken place. The investigation revealed that evidence had been moved and stored across several locations over time, complicating the forensic process and demonstrating a level of planning intended to avoid detection. As the case moved to trial, the volume and nature of evidence presented proved overwhelming for many involved. Multiple jurors reportedly struggled with the material, and the proceedings were subject to extensive suppression orders to ensure fair trials and protect legal integrity. In September 2003, both Bunting and Wagner were convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to consecutive life terms. The presiding judge stated that the offenders showed no capacity for genuine rehabilitation. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Media coverage focused not only on the crimes themselves, but on how such events could occur within ordinary neighborhoods without earlier intervention. The town of Snowtown faced unwanted attention, with visitors arriving simply to see the location associated with the case. Local residents expressed frustration that their community name had become synonymous with crimes committed largely elsewhere. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate area. The case forced broader discussions in Australia about social isolation, misinformation, and how extremist beliefs can escalate when reinforced within closed groups. It also highlighted weaknesses in systems designed to track missing persons and protect vulnerable individuals. In 2011, the story reached an even wider audience with the release of the film Snowtown, which focused on the influence Bunting held over those around him. The film, like many documentaries and books that followed, emphasized that the true horror of the case lay not only in the acts themselves, but in how gradually and quietly they unfolded. Today, Robert Joe Wagner remains incarcerated, serving multiple life sentences, while the Snowtown murders are studied as a cautionary example of how dangerous ideologies, when combined with manipulation and silence, can result in irreversible harm. For the families of the victims, the passage of time has not erased the loss, but it has reinforced the importance of remembering the individuals affected rather than reducing them to headlines. Case 3. John Miles Sharp. The case of John Miles Sharp remains one of the most disturbing family crime cases in Australian criminal history, not because of mystery, but because of how carefully it was concealed in plain sight. In March 2004, what appeared to be a routine missing persons case in suburban Australia slowly unraveled into a story that shocked the public and left investigators struggling to comprehend the mindset behind it. Sharp was born on February 28, 1967, and grew up in the Mornington Peninsula area near Melbourne. By all outward appearances, his life followed an ordinary path. He worked in banking, later moving into conveyancing, and was known as quiet, socially withdrawn, and largely unremarkable. There was no visible criminal history, no prior violent behavior, and nothing that suggested he would one day become known by the media as the Speargun Killer or the Mornington Monster. Sharp met Anna Kemp while they both worked at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Anna, originally from New Zealand, was 4 years older than him. They married in October 1994 and spent years living around the Mornington Peninsula. In August 2002, they welcomed their daughter, Gracie Louise Sharp. Gracie was born with a hip condition that required early medical support, and while doctors expected a full recovery, the early months were stressful. Friends later said Anna appeared anxious and exhausted, while Sharp seemed increasingly detached. In late 2003, Anna became pregnant again. According to Sharp's later statements, this second pregnancy came as a shock to him and became a source of growing resentment. Around this same period, Sharp purchased a high-powered spear gun, despite having no interest in spearfishing. He reportedly tested it once in his backyard, a detail that would later become crucial. On March 21, 2004, the family attended a birthday gathering for a nephew. Relatives noticed no arguments, no unusual tension, and nothing that hinted at what would follow. 2 days later, on the evening of March the 23rd, Sharp and Anna reportedly argued before going to bed. What happened next was known only through Sharp's later confession. After lying awake for some time, he went to the garage, retrieved the spear gun, and returned to the bedroom. Anna was asleep. Sharp discharged the weapon at close range. When he realized she was still breathing, he used it again. Anna did not survive. Rather than contacting emergency services, Sharp covered her body and went downstairs to sleep. Over the following days, he continued daily routines as if nothing had happened. He took Gracie to childcare, spoke to neighbors, and even lied to a technician who came to the house, preventing the discovery of what had occurred upstairs. Eventually, he buried Anna in a shallow grave in the backyard. What followed was a calculated effort to maintain a false narrative. Sharp told friends and family that Anna had left him for another man. He claimed she had moved away and taken Gracie with her, even though the child was still in his care. He sent messages pretending to be Anna, and later arranged flowers to be delivered to her mother, signed in Anna's name. On March 27, 2004, Sharp put Gracie to bed and consumed alcohol, later telling police he was trying to numb himself. That night, he retrieved the spear gun again. Gracie was asleep in her cot. The act that followed would later be described in court as one of the most distressing elements of the case. Despite multiple attempts, the child did not pass immediately. Only after repeated actions did she stop breathing. The following morning, Sharp wrapped Gracie's body and disposed of it at a local waste transfer station, discarding the spear gun and other items at the same time. Days later, he returned to the backyard, unearthed Anna's remains, and used tools purchased from a hardware store to divide them before disposing of them in landfill. As concern grew in New Zealand, Anna's family reported her missing. Police inquiries began in both countries. Sharp continued to maintain his story, even appearing on national television, speaking emotionally about his missing wife and daughter, and asking for public help. These interviews, later replayed in court, would become chilling examples of deception. On June 22, 2004, police arrested Sharp. During initial questioning, he denied any involvement. After speaking with his family, he confessed to both acts. A massive landfill search followed, lasting weeks, eventually recovering the remains of both Anna and Gracie. In August 2005, Sharp appeared before the Supreme Court of Victoria. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. The sentencing judge described the acts as too awful to contemplate and emphasized the planning, deception, and breach of trust involved. Sharp was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 33 years. Psychiatric assessments later presented to the court found no evidence of psychosis. Instead, experts described Sharp as emotionally dependent, socially withdrawn, and unable to cope with stress. While some depressive symptoms were identified, the court concluded he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The Sharp case remains a stark reminder that the most serious crimes do not always come with warning signs. It illustrates how deception can persist for months, how public performances can mask private realities, and how the most dangerous situations sometimes unfold quietly behind closed doors. For investigators, the case became an example of how persistence, cross-border cooperation, and forensic effort can uncover the truth. For the public, it remains one of Australia's most haunting family crime stories. And for the victims, Anna and Gracie Sharp, it stands as a tragedy defined not by mystery, but by irreversible loss. Case 4. Lee Robinson. Robinson was born in 1948 and grew up in Australia with a childhood marked by instability and fractured family relationships. According to later psychological reports, his early years were shaped by absence, emotional neglect, and behavioral issues that went largely unchecked. By his late teens, Robinson was already showing signs of aggression, possessiveness, and hostility toward those around him. These traits would soon escalate into something far more serious. In June 1968, Robinson was 20 years old and living in Melbourne, Victoria. He had been in a turbulent relationship with 17-year-old Valerie Ethel Dunn, a young woman who had recently tried to distance herself from him. Friends and family later recalled that Valerie had begun to fear Robinson's erratic behavior, especially after incidents involving threats and reckless conduct. What followed would permanently alter the lives of everyone connected to her. On June 8, 1968, a confrontation took place inside the Dunn family home in Chadstone. During that encounter, Valerie Dunn lost her life after being attacked with a kitchen knife. Her former boyfriend, Des Gruar, attempted to intervene and was seriously injured while trying to help her escape. Robinson fled the scene, but was arrested later that same day. The brutality of the incident shocked the local community and dominated national headlines. Robinson was charged, tried, and ultimately convicted of murder. In November 1968, he was sentenced to death, reflecting the gravity with which the justice system initially viewed the crime. However, less than a year later, that sentence was commuted to 30 years in prison. Despite the original penalty, Robinson would serve only 15 years before being released on parole in 1983. For the Dunn family and for Valerie's loved ones, the release felt like a reopening of an unhealed wound. After leaving prison, Robinson attempted to rebuild his life on the surface. He formed relationships, found work, and appeared to some as a man who had paid his debt to society. But beneath that appearance, troubling patterns continued. In the years following his release, Robinson was convicted of serious sexual offenses involving underage girls, including members of his own household. These crimes resulted in additional prison time during the 1990s, reinforcing concerns that he posed an ongoing risk to others. One of the most harrowing voices to emerge during this period was that of Louise Lesser, Robinson's former stepdaughter. She later spoke publicly about years of abuse she endured, beginning when she was only 13. Her testimony described a climate of fear, manipulation, and threats that kept her silent for years. When she finally reported what had happened, it led to Robinson's conviction and imprisonment, but at a devastating personal cost, including estrangement from her family. Despite these convictions, Robinson was again released. By the mid-2000s, he was living in Victoria and had begun a relationship with Tracy Greenberry, a 33-year-old mother of two from Frankston. Tracy was aware of Robinson's past murder conviction, but like many partners of violent offenders, she believed that enough time had passed for him to have changed. Those close to her, including her father, expressed serious concerns, but Tracy hoped rehabilitation was possible. The relationship quickly became volatile. According to later court findings, arguments escalated and Robinson became increasingly controlling and aggressive. In April 2008, following another dispute, Tracy attempted to flee and seek help from neighbors. In broad daylight, Robinson pursued her and fatally shot her with a shotgun outside a nearby home. The killing unfolded in front of witnesses and sent shockwaves through the community. Robinson was arrested the same day and charged with murder. During the trial, prosecutors emphasized not only the circumstances of Tracy Greenberry's death, but Robinson's long history of violence against women. The court heard that Tracy had been terrified in her final moments and posed no threat to him. The pattern was unmistakable. When faced with rejection or loss of control, Robinson responded with lethal force. In January 2010, Robinson was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Justice Simon Whelan stated that there was a pressing need to permanently protect the community from him. Supporters of Tracy Greenberry erupted in applause as the sentence was delivered, expressing relief that Robinson would never be free again. For Tracy's parents, the ruling brought a measure of closure, though nothing could undo their loss. The case reignited public debate about sentencing, parole, and whether violent offenders can truly be rehabilitated. Many questioned how a man once sentenced to death for murder, later convicted of sexual crimes, could be released multiple times. Former detectives involved in the original 1968 investigation described Robinson as one of the most dangerous individuals they had encountered during their careers. For survivors like Louise Lesser, the sentence came with mixed emotions. While she expressed relief that Robinson could no longer harm anyone, she also spoke openly about the lifelong trauma she continues to carry. Her story, like those of Valerie Dunn and Tracy Greenberry, highlights how violence extends far beyond a single moment, shaping lives for decades. Today, Lee Robinson remains behind bars, serving a life sentence with no chance of release. His case stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when warning signs are missed or underestimated. It also serves as a call to listen to victims, take patterns of behavior seriously, and recognize that accountability does not end when a prison gate opens. Case 5. Robin Reed. On a quiet evening in early May 1982, a terrified 13-year-old boy ran into his family home in suburban Brisbane and told a story so disturbing that it would soon grip an entire nation. What he described was not a misunderstanding or a youthful prank, but a calculated act of cruelty carried out by two adults who had crossed a line that could never be undone. This is the story of the murder of Peter Aston and the events that led to one of the most infamous criminal cases in Australian history. The case unfolded in Queensland, Australia, at a time when hitchhiking was still seen by many teenagers as a harmless way to travel. Peter Aston was a tall, shy schoolboy who had recently moved from another state and struggled to fit in. On the morning of May 4th, 1982, he decided to leave Brisbane and travel south to reunite with his older brother. His close friend Terry Ryan agreed to accompany him part of the way, unaware that this simple decision would change both of their lives forever. After skipping school, the boys spent the morning riding trains, buying inexpensive clothes, and eventually walking along the highway with their thumbs out. It was there that they were approached by two men in a yellow four-wheel drive vehicle who introduced themselves casually as Bob and Paul. The men appeared ordinary, relaxed, and willing to help. Trusting their instincts, the boys accepted the offer of a ride. Within minutes of getting into the vehicle, the situation shifted. What began as small talk quickly turned into intimidation. The boys were restrained and threatened, and the car was driven across the state border into New South Wales. Isolated from help and overwhelmed by fear, the teenagers were taken to a remote coastal area near Kingscliff, far from passing traffic or witnesses. What followed was a prolonged ordeal marked by cruelty, control, and psychological terror. Peter Aston endured repeated physical harm, while Terry Ryan was forced to witness events no child should ever see. The attackers used fear to dominate both boys, making it clear that resistance would only make things worse. As the night progressed, the situation escalated beyond recovery. Peter Aston did not survive. After the crime, the attackers made a chilling decision. Instead of silencing both boys, they drove Terry Ryan back to his neighborhood, issuing threats meant to ensure his silence. But fear did not outweigh conscience. Shaken and traumatized, Terry immediately told his mother everything. She wasted no time contacting police. In the early hours of the following morning, investigators followed Terry's directions to a secluded bush track. What they discovered confirmed the worst. A shallow grave concealed the body of Peter Aston, and forensic evidence indicated that he had been alive when buried. The discovery stunned even seasoned detectives and triggered an urgent manhunt. Attention quickly turned to the description Terry provided of the suspects and their vehicle. Police broadcasts went out across Queensland and New South Wales, warning the public to stay clear. Meanwhile, the two men attempted to flee by stealing a car from a fellow Army private at the Inagara military base, where both were stationed. Their escape plan was poorly executed and short-lived. Within 48 hours, police intercepted the stolen vehicle on a major highway and arrested both suspects without resistance. Inside the car, officers found items that matched Terry Ryan's account. A search of their shared room at the Army base revealed an extensive collection of weapons and written materials that suggested violent fantasies long before the crime occurred. The men were identified as Robin Reed, a 34-year-old corporal in the Australian Army, and Paul Luckman, a 17-year-old private. Despite their age difference, the two had formed an intense bond built on shared obsessions and a desire for control. Investigators later concluded that the crime was not spontaneous, but the result of ideas that had been discussed and rehearsed. During police interviews, both men attempted to shift blame onto each other. Their statements were inconsistent, self-serving, and contradicted by physical evidence in Terry Ryan's testimony. Reed, in particular, appeared eager to speak, offering detailed accounts and showing little awareness of the gravity of his actions. Detectives later remarked that he seemed to enjoy the attention, mistaking notoriety for importance. The case attracted enormous public outrage. Media coverage was relentless, and emotions ran high as the community struggled to comprehend how such an act could occur. Security around court proceedings was tightened due to threats and protests, and the trial was moved to Sydney to ensure fairness and safety. When the trial began in November 1982, both defendants entered not guilty pleas. Reed claimed mental instability, while Luckman portrayed himself as manipulated and fearful. However, the prosecution focused on the overwhelming evidence and the clear sequence of events. Out of respect for the jury, graphic photographs were not shown, with testimony used instead to convey the seriousness of the crime. After deliberation, the jury found both men guilty. The judge described the offense as one of the most brutal crimes ever brought before the court in that state. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment, ending a chapter of violence but leaving lasting scars on everyone involved. In the years that followed, Robin Reed remained in custody under strict conditions. Multiple parole applications were denied, with authorities citing the severity of the crime and lack of genuine rehabilitation. His name became permanently associated with one of Australia's darkest criminal cases. Paul Luckman later transitioned and changed her name to Nicole Louise Pierce. After serving a reduced sentence, she was released in the late 1990s, a decision that sparked public debate and protest. Criminologists expressed concern, arguing that the risk factors identified during earlier assessments had not disappeared with time. For Terry Ryan, freedom came at a high cost. Despite being a victim, he faced judgment, bullying, and isolation. Trauma followed him into adulthood, affecting his mental health and life choices. His story remains a painful reminder that survival does not always mean escape from consequences. Case 6. Bradley John Murdoch. Bradley John Murdoch, born in 1958, is serving a life sentence for the alleged disappearance and presumed murder of British backpacker Peter Falconio in the Australian outback in 2001. The case remains one of the most discussed and mysterious incidents in modern Australian criminal history. Falconio, 28, a graduate from Brighton University, was traveling through the Northern Territory with his girlfriend Joanne Lees when they encountered Murdoch along a remote stretch of the Stuart Highway. What began as a road trip turned into a chilling chain of events that has been analyzed, debated, and retold in books, documentaries, and media reports for over 2 decades. Before the events of 2001, Murdoch lived in Broome, Western Australia, working as a truck driver and mechanic. His criminal record included a suspended sentence in 1980 for causing death by dangerous driving and a 1995 imprisonment for shooting at people celebrating at a football match in the Kimberley region. These previous incidents contributed to a public perception of Murdoch as a man with a volatile past, though the events surrounding Falconio's disappearance added layers of complexity that remain disputed to this day. On July 14, 2001, Falconio and Lees were traveling at night when their vehicle was flagged down by a man claiming there was a problem with their van's exhaust. Falconio reportedly stepped out to check the vehicle, and Lees heard what she believed to be a gunshot. She described being forced into a ute by her assailant, with her wrists bound and a sack over her head. According to her account, she managed to escape, hiding in the surrounding scrubland, while Murdoch searched with a flashlight and a cattle dog. Falconio was never seen again. The investigation quickly focused on Murdoch, who by 2003 was living in Adelaide and already facing unrelated charges. Lees identified his photograph as the man responsible for her abduction, and DNA evidence allegedly linked Murdoch to Lees's clothing. Yet the case was far from straightforward. Lees's testimony contained inconsistencies, including details about Murdoch's vehicle, his dog, and even some aspects of her own whereabouts. Defense lawyers highlighted these inconsistencies, questioning whether the evidence against Murdoch was reliable. Some experts even noted that blood samples at the scene were old, and there were no other footprints or traces in the surrounding area, raising questions about the timeline and events described by Lees. During the trial, Murdoch maintained his innocence. His legal team argued that police procedures were flawed and that Lees's identification was influenced by media coverage and photographs she had seen online before speaking with authorities. They suggested that Falconio might have staged his own disappearance, and that Murdoch had been framed, possibly by a former associate with motives related to drug offenses. Aboriginal trackers and other investigators also raised doubts about the physical evidence, noting the absence of key indicators such as fresh footprints, a body, or clear traces of struggle in the scrubland described by Lees. Despite these claims, the prosecution argued that Murdaugh had been in the vicinity of the alleged crime. Surveillance footage placed him at a service station near Alice Springs on the night of Falconio's disappearance. They presented DNA matches on Lisa's t-shirt, the couple's vehicle, and the bindings used to restrain her. Rex Weil QC, representing the Northern Territory Director of Public Prosecutions, emphasized that the pattern of behavior indicated a calculated and methodical approach, suggesting premeditation. The prosecution painted Murdaugh as a man determined to eliminate evidence and avoid detection, reinforcing their argument for a life sentence. The trial, which began in October 2005 and concluded in May 2006, drew immense media attention. The Darwin Supreme Court was specially refitted to accommodate the volume of journalists and court staff. After careful deliberation, the jury convicted Murdaugh of the murder of Falconio and assaults on Lees, sentencing him to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 28 years. Murdaugh appealed the conviction multiple times, arguing the evidence was flawed, the testimony unreliable, and police procedures inconsistent. All appeals were ultimately denied, including a final request for special leave to the High Court of Australia in 2007. Murdaugh has continued to assert his innocence, claiming that the DNA evidence could have been planted and that he had no involvement in Falconio's disappearance. In interviews from prison, he admitted to drug-related offenses but denied committing murder, suggesting that Falconio may still be alive and that his disappearance remains unresolved. Books based on interviews with Murdaugh, such as Robin Bowles' Dead Center, highlight his perspective on the case, portraying him as defiant yet prepared to serve time if found guilty. The mystery of Falconio's body remains a central aspect of the case. Despite extensive searches and ongoing speculation, no remains have been discovered. Some media outlets suggested that Murdaugh might reveal the location of the body in exchange for a prison transfer closer to his ill mother, though he has denied possessing such knowledge. Aboriginal trackers and other investigators continue to question certain details of Lees's account, creating ongoing debate about the true sequence of events on that fateful night. Adding to the intrigue are questions surrounding media representation and public perception. Films, documentaries, and books have explored the Falconio case, often dramatizing events and adding narrative layers that influence how the public understands the story. Channel 10 in Australia aired a perspective from Lees in 2007, providing insight into her experience and the trial. However, these portrayals have been met with both criticism and acclaim, illustrating the tension between factual reporting and the dramatization of true crime events for entertainment purposes. The legal proceedings also expose the intricacies of the Australian judicial system. Chief Justice Brian Ross Martin instructed jurors to focus solely on the evidence presented in court, avoiding assumptions based on Murdaugh's past behavior or media portrayals. The jury was tasked with evaluating whether the DNA evidence and testimony of Lees were sufficient to conclude that Murdaugh had attacked her and was responsible for Falconio's presumed death. Ultimately, the jury concluded that the prosecution had met the burden of proof, resulting in Murdaugh's conviction. Beyond the trial, Murdaugh's case prompted law enforcement to re-examine other unsolved crimes in Western Australia. Authorities explored possible links between Murdaugh and cold cases, including the Claremont serial killings and disappearances of young women. While no direct connections have been established, the scrutiny underscores the broader implications of high-profile criminal cases, where patterns of behavior and criminal profiles are analyzed for links to other unsolved incidents. Murdaugh's time in prison has been marked by continued legal and personal developments. Reports indicate that he has focused on physical fitness and routine within incarceration facilities, portraying a desire to maintain control over his life despite imprisonment. His comments about daily life in prison, combined with his claims of innocence, contribute to the enduring public fascination with the case. Even after decades, the Peter Falconio case remains a topic of discussion among true crime enthusiasts, legal scholars, and journalists. The disappearance, the disputed evidence, and the ongoing questions about Murdaugh's guilt or innocence create a complex narrative that challenges easy conclusions. While Murdoch's conviction stands, the absence of a body and the unresolved details ensure that the story continues to captivate those who study or follow Australian criminal history. Case 7. William Patrick Mitchell. On February 21, 1993, the small rural town of Greenock in Western Australia was forever changed by a tragedy that shocked the nation. The peaceful life of Karen Mackenzie, 31, and her 3 children, Daniel, 16, Amara, 7, and Katrina, 5, was brutally interrupted in a way that would haunt the community for decades. The events of that day became known as the Greenock family massacre, a crime that remains one of the most infamous in Western Australian history. What unfolded that morning was a chilling reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be shattered by violence. Karen Mackenzie and her family lived on a remote property 400 kilometers north of Perth. That morning began like any other, but the arrival of a familiar face would change everything. William Patrick Mitchell, a friend of the family, had been spending the day under the influence of a dangerous mix of substances. What started as a personal vendetta and a drug-fueled haze would escalate into a night of unthinkable horror. As Daniel Mackenzie went outside to greet the visitor, he was confronted by Mitchell, and the situation quickly turned deadly. What followed was a series of attacks that would claim the lives of 4 innocent people. The investigation that followed revealed the horrifying scale of the crime. Police and forensic teams meticulously combed the scene for evidence. Yet it took 5 weeks before they were able to identify and arrest Mitchell. The small community of Greenock was left reeling, struggling to understand how someone they knew could commit such a devastating act. Despite the brutality of the crime, details of how the children were attacked were sealed from the public by the court to prevent further trauma, illustrating just how severe the case had been. Mitchell's trial would later reveal disturbing details about his state of mind. On the day of the murders, he had been under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, and amphetamines. His actions were calculated, yet fueled by a reckless and dangerous high. After killing Daniel, he went on to Karen, who was asleep in the lounge room. The attack left her dead, and the 2 young daughters, Amara and Katrina, were found in their bedrooms. The court deemed the specifics of the children's deaths too graphic for public disclosure, a decision that highlighted the extreme nature of the crime. For law enforcement, the case was both challenging and emotionally draining. Detectives described being deeply affected by the scenes they encountered, with some reporting long-term psychological impact. Investigators noted that the crime was so extreme that it led to public discussions about the death penalty, reflecting the widespread horror and disbelief that gripped the community. The Greenock family massacre became more than a criminal case. It was a social and psychological event that shook the region. Key evidence in the case came from unusual sources. Among the items linking Mitchell to the crime was a hand lotion he had used, which became a critical forensic clue. Additionally, a psychic named Gabriel claimed to have assisted investigators by providing a profile of the perpetrator, including his name and address, as well as overlooked details that helped redirect forensic analysis. While some of these claims remain controversial, they underscore the community's desperate search for answers and justice. Mitchell eventually pleaded guilty to 4 counts of willful murder and several counts of sexual assault. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 20 years. The sentence was adjusted due to public outcry, reflecting the anger and fear that lingered long after the events. Despite numerous appeals and legal proceedings, Mitchell's eligibility for parole was reinstated, raising concerns among victims' families and local authorities about the possibility of his release. Over the years, the aftermath of the Greenock tragedy continued to impact those connected to the case. Barbara Marchant, Karen Mackenzie's mother, received threatening correspondence in 2007, believed to be linked to Mitchell or his associates. The family lived under ongoing stress and fear, illustrating the enduring shadow cast by one day's events. For many, the Greenock massacre was not just a historical crime, it remained a personal and emotional wound. In the years following the murders, Mitchell was transferred to Bunbury Regional Prison under medium security. By 2009, concerns about his eventual parole resurfaced, particularly from those who knew the family. Advocates and friends of the victims campaigned to ensure he remained behind bars, reflecting ongoing fear and the deep emotional scars left by the case. The parole process became a focal point for public debate about justice, rehabilitation, and safety in the community. The psychological impact of the Greeno massacre extended beyond the immediate family. Local police officers, many of whom worked on the investigation, reported lingering trauma. Some stated they would never return to investigating similar crimes due to the emotional toll. The case highlighted the human cost of violent crime, not only for victims and families, but also for those charged with maintaining law and order. For the Mackenzie family, the loss was unimaginable. Daniel, Amara, and Katrina were taken in a matter of minutes, and Karen's life was brutally ended in her own home. The case drew attention to the vulnerability of families in remote areas and sparked discussions about community safety, law enforcement response, and legal protections. The Mackenzie family's experience served as a grim reminder of how quickly ordinary life could be shattered. The community of Greeno has never forgotten that February morning. Even decades later, the memories of the tragedy linger, a testament to its impact. Local commemorations and media coverage often revisit the story, reflecting ongoing concern about Mitchell's potential release and the desire to honor the victims. The massacre left a permanent mark on the area, shaping the collective consciousness of the town and influencing local crime awareness and prevention efforts. Case 8. Matthew Milat. Matthew Milat, the teenage great-nephew of infamous serial offender Ivan Milat, became the focus of national attention when he was convicted of a chilling murder in New South Wales, Australia. Born in December 1992, Matthew was only 17 when he committed the act that would forever tie his name to the dark history of the Belanglo State Forest, the same forest where his great-uncle carried out the notorious backpacker murders in the 1990s. On November 20th, 2010, Matthew, alongside an accomplice, lured his childhood friend, 17-year-old David Ochterlony, into the dense bushland under the pretext of hanging out and smoking cannabis. What began as an ordinary evening for two teenagers turned into a calculated and terrifying crime. David, unsuspecting and trusting, followed them into the shadows of Belanglo, never imagining that the night would end in tragedy. Once there, the situation escalated quickly. Matthew accused David of spreading information about his personal life and began an intense verbal confrontation. The argument intensified, and Matthew used a medieval-style double-headed axe to assault David. The brutal attack lasted several minutes, during which Matthew and his accomplice, Cohen Klein, who was 18 at the time, kept David restrained and terrified. Klein, influenced by Matthew's presence and intimidation, recorded parts of the incident on his mobile phone, capturing audio evidence that would later shock the court and the public. A third teenager present, Chase Day, attempted to intervene, pleading for Matthew to stop, but he was firmly told to stay back, illustrating the chilling control Matthew exerted over the scene. The location itself held dark significance. Belanglo State Forest was already infamous for Ivan Milat's crimes, where 7 backpackers had met their deaths under grim circumstances. For authorities and the public, Matthew's choice of location added a layer of haunting familiarity and foreboding, linking his actions to the past atrocities committed by his great-uncle. The aftermath of the attack revealed disturbing insights into Matthew's mindset. During court proceedings, several poems written by him while in custody were presented as evidence. One, titled "Killer Looks and On Evil Side," spoke of trust, betrayal, and danger, while another, "Cold Life," contained verses describing a lack of remorse and an apparent fascination with violence. These writings were interpreted by the court as a reflection of Matthew's engagement with dark thoughts, rather than an expression of regret for his actions. In sentencing, acting Justice Jane Matthews described the murder as deliberate, premeditated, and cruel. Matthew was sentenced to a maximum of 43 years in prison with a 30-year non-parole period, while Cohen Klein received a maximum sentence of 32 years, with 22 years non-parole. The judge emphasized that Matthew's actions were motivated by a desire for personal thrill rather than any external pressure or provocation, noting that he took David's life in a manner that was both calculated and terrifying. The audio recording played in court revealed David's cries and pleas, juxtaposed with Matthew's cold commands and threats. The recording, though deeply distressing to the victim's family, provided clear evidence of the assault and its intentional nature. Statements from David's family captured their grief and shock, particularly given the timing of the murder on David's 17th birthday. His father, David Ochterlony Sr., recounted wishing his son a happy birthday just hours before his death and described the anguish of seeing his child's body in the hospital, a place where he had once cradled him as a baby. Matthew's lack of visible remorse and, in some accounts, his boasting about the crime afterward, amplified the public's sense of horror. He reportedly told others, referencing his infamous family name, that he had acted in the manner his family does. Authorities noted that despite his youth, Matthew presented a serious potential danger to the community, and the court rejected any sentence reduction based on his guilty plea. The crime had ripple effects beyond the immediate tragedy. Belanglo State Forest, already a site of national infamy, became a symbol of recurring horror, and the local community struggled to comprehend how another young life could be lost in such a brutal way in a place already associated with unspeakable acts. Law enforcement described the murder as both torturous and terrorizing, highlighting the psychological torment inflicted on David in addition to the physical harm. For investigators, the case raised questions about the influence of family history, youth, and peer dynamics in violent behavior. The involvement of multiple teenagers, the premeditated planning, and the use of an accomplice to document the crime showcased a disturbing level of awareness and control in Matthew's actions. During the investigation, authorities recovered evidence from the scene, including alcohol and drug paraphernalia, suggesting that the group had consumed substances earlier in the evening. However, these factors did not mitigate the deliberate nature of the attack. The investigation also involved careful forensic procedures, including swabs and nail scrapings from the accused, to confirm involvement and reconstruct the events. Community and family reactions to the sentencing were intense. Members of both the Ochterlony and Milov families were present in court, witnessing the outcome of a crime that had shattered lives and reopened wounds tied to past tragedies in the forest. The courtroom atmosphere was charged with grief, anger, and a search for justice. The public was reminded of the long-lasting impact of violent crimes, particularly when they occur in contexts connected to notorious cases. For Matthew, the sentence serves as a stark marker of accountability. With parole eligibility set for 2040, his actions will remain a part of his record and serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of violence and the choices made in moments of anger and thrill-seeking. The case also underscores the importance of community vigilance and the role of law enforcement in responding swiftly to tip-offs and evidence. In reflecting on the incident, legal experts and commentators have discussed the combination of youthful recklessness, familial notoriety, and the allure of infamy as contributing factors in such crimes. Case 9. Jeremy George Edward McLaughlin. Jeremy George Edward McLaughlin's story is one that spans countries and decades, a chilling account of violence, deception, and the far-reaching consequences of criminal behavior. Born in 1978, McLaughlin's early brushes with the law foreshadowed a darker path. By the time he reached adolescence, his criminal record already included robbery and destructive acts, signaling a troubling pattern that authorities would come to track across Australia and New Zealand. At the age of 17, McLaughlin committed his first known severe offense, resulting in the death of 14-year-old Philip Vido in Perth, Western Australia. Philip and his friend Tyrone Williams had gone out for a routine shopping trip, never imagining that it would end in tragedy. The two were assaulted with a cricket bat and later run over by a vehicle. Philip did not survive the attack, and Tyrone spent 8 days in a coma, suffering permanent injuries. McLaughlin and an accomplice faced serious charges. While the jury ultimately convicted them of manslaughter rather than murder, the incident exposed a young man capable of extreme violence. McLaughlin was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and in 2001, following his release, he was deported back to New Zealand. It was in Christchurch, New Zealand, that McLaughlin's pattern of violent behavior would tragically continue. On November 10, 2011, he entered the home of a former partner, Tina Bayliss, under the guise of burglary. That day, her 13-year-old daughter, Jade Bayliss, was home ill from school. What started as a property crime escalated into a heartbreaking tragedy. Jade was strangled with a ligature, and a sock was placed in her mouth. Afterwards, McLaughlin set the house on fire, reportedly intending to intimidate Tina. Jade's life was cruelly cut short, and her death sparked shock and outrage across the community. McLaughlin's trial revealed a meticulous investigation. Surveillance footage showed him selling items from the burglary at pawn shops, and Jade's wallet was found shortly afterward in a public parking lot. Forensic evidence, including McLaughlin's DNA under Jade's fingernail, firmly linked him to the scene. Despite his denials, the mounting evidence made his claims of innocence increasingly difficult to sustain. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before finding him guilty of Jade's murder, confirming a pattern of dangerous behavior that spanned years and continents. The case also highlighted the limitations of prior knowledge sharing between countries. The New Zealand authorities were not fully aware of McLaughlin's Australian manslaughter conviction at the time of his return, underscoring a gap in systems that could have prevented subsequent harm. Following his conviction, there were calls from legal experts and family members for improved communication between Australia and New Zealand regarding serious offenders, and for a registry of deported criminals to protect communities from repeat offenses. During sentencing on October 9, 2013, Justice Graham Pankhurst described McLaughlin's actions as brutal and senseless. Although the Crown sought a life sentence without parole, the court imposed a life sentence with a 23-year non-parole period. McLaughlin would be almost 60 before eligibility for release, with strict conditions to protect the public. The decision sparked debate, with victims' advocates arguing for harsher penalties to prevent future tragedies. Families affected by McLaughlin's actions shared their grief publicly. Tina Bayliss described her daughter as the apple of my eye, a bright, exceptional student whose life had been stolen. Philip Vidau's mother, Maria, expressed relief that McLaughlin was serving a lengthy term, but lamented the loss of 2 innocent young lives. The combined tragedies of Perth and Christchurch emphasized the devastating ripple effects of one individual's repeated criminal behavior. Throughout the trial, McLaughlin maintained his innocence regarding the murder itself, admitting only to the burglary and arson. He claimed he had not seen Jade during the burglary and that the subsequent fire was intended to intimidate his former partner, rather than to cover a violent act. His defense attempted to portray a chaotic sequence of coincidences, arguing that another person might have committed the fatal act. However, this narrative was consistently undermined by the strong forensic and circumstantial evidence collected by authorities. McLaughlin's behavior before and after the crime offered insight into his mindset. Witnesses described him as calm, composed, and even casual in his interactions, a stark contrast to the severity of the acts he committed. He was observed conducting routine activities such as shopping and paying rent immediately after the crimes, behaviors that contradicted the profile of someone overwhelmed by guilt or panic. This methodical approach, combined with his prior history, painted the picture of a person capable of detachment from the harm he caused. The trial also explored McLaughlin's motives and personal history. Psychiatric reports suggested a pattern of self-focus and vengefulness, with a tendency to deflect responsibility onto others. While he did not exhibit symptoms of mental illness, his past actions, including previous assaults and property crimes, indicated a high risk of repeat offenses. Legal experts noted that McLaughlin's continued denials and the strategic nature of his behavior complicated prospects for rehabilitation. McLaughlin's interactions with accomplices, particularly Jolan Aaron Scott Sweeney, further illuminated the case. Sweeney admitted to helping McLaughlin conceal evidence and faced charges related to being an accessory after the fact. However, authorities could not link Sweeney directly to the murder itself. The coordinated efforts to dispose of stolen items and conceal the crime underscored the premeditated elements in McLaughlin's actions. In addition to legal proceedings, the case prompted societal reflections on child safety, justice system coordination, and parole practices. Families and advocacy groups called for reforms to prevent individuals with histories of serious offenses from slipping through systemic gaps. The case served as a stark reminder that the consequences of violent acts extend far beyond immediate victims, impacting families, communities, and legal frameworks. Case 10. Christopher Wayne Hudson. On the morning of June 18, 2007, the bustling streets of Melbourne's central business district were shattered by a shocking act of violence that would leave the city reeling. Christopher Wayne Hudson, a 31-year-old member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, became the center of one of the most notorious incidents in Melbourne's recent history when he opened fire on 3 people during a heated confrontation. Among those targeted was 43-year-old solicitor Brendan Keelar, who would tragically lose his life, while 2 others, including a Dutch backpacker and a local woman, were seriously injured. The chain of events that led to this morning of chaos was steeped in a history of gang affiliations, substance abuse, and escalating aggression that ultimately culminated in Hudson's fateful actions. Hudson had been a full member of the Hells Angels, having defected from a rival gang, the Finks, just a year prior. This transition did not come without friction. In 2006, he had been involved in a violent altercation between the 2 motorcycle clubs at a kickboxing tournament on the Gold Coast, where he was shot in the chin, signaling the level of danger that came with gang rivalries. In the days leading up to the shootings, Hudson had displayed increasingly reckless behavior, including firing at police in Campbellfield after a night of drinking with professional footballer Alan Didak. Didak later told authorities he had been intoxicated and not in control of events, highlighting the chaotic environment Hudson had immersed himself in. The night before the shooting, Hudson had spent hours drinking at King Street venues known for nightlife activity. In the early hours of June 18th, he assaulted Autumn Daly Holt, a co-worker of his girlfriend, and soon after contacted 24-year-old Kara Douglas, his girlfriend, to come pick him up. What happened next would spiral into tragedy. Hudson dragged Douglas into the street, creating a scene at the intersection of William Street and Flinders Lane. 2 bystanders, Brendan Keelar and 25-year-old Dutch backpacker Paul de Ward, attempted to intervene, seeking to help Douglas. Hudson, in a state influenced by alcohol and drugs, drew a firearm and shot all 3. Keelar suffered fatal injuries, while de Ward and Douglas were critically wounded. Douglas later had to undergo a kidney removal due to her injuries. Hudson fled the scene as emergency services rushed to aid the victims. He discarded his jacket and firearm near a construction site, which were later found by workers. Amid the ensuing panic, nearby buildings were evacuated as authorities conducted thorough searches for the gunman. His car, a black Honda CR-V with New South Wales plates, was abandoned nearby, while another vehicle, a Mercedes-Benz sedan, was later located in Richmond. Hudson then sought refuge at a Hells Angels safe house north of Melbourne. 2 days later, on June 20th, he surrendered to police at Wallen, calmly walking into the station and presenting himself to authorities without incident. Once in custody, Hudson faced multiple charges, including the murder of Brendan Keelar, 2 counts of attempted murder, causing serious injury, and unlawful imprisonment. Additional charges followed related to his previous incidents with law enforcement and gang activities. The trial revealed not only the brutality of his actions, but also the complex web of gang dynamics and drug use that had influenced his behavior. In May 2009, allegations surfaced claiming Hudson had been subjected to punishment by his own gang before surrendering, with some members reportedly using a blowtorch to remove a Hells Angels tattoo from his arm. While police and other sources denied these claims, it painted a picture of internal conflict within the gang and the dangerous culture Hudson was immersed in. The victims faced lasting consequences. Douglas survived but lost a kidney, Daly Holt suffered permanent facial nerve damage, and de Ward returned to the Netherlands for extensive rehabilitation. The psychological scars ran deep for all involved. During his court appearances, Hudson displayed a calm demeanor, seemingly unaffected by the gravity of his actions. Psychiatric reports described him as of low intellect but not suffering from a mental disorder, though his use of steroids, alcohol, and drugs contributed to aggressive and narcissistic tendencies. The court was presented with a detailed account of the shooting. Hudson had attacked Daly Holt at the nightclub and then turned his aggression toward Douglas. Keelar and de Ward intervened, only to be met with gunfire. Keelar was shot multiple times, ultimately losing his life at the scene. Hudson pleaded guilty to murder and attempted murder, leading Justice Paul Coughlin to sentence him to life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years before parole eligibility, meaning Hudson would be 65 before he could hope for release. The court acknowledged his remorse, but emphasized the calculated and dangerous nature of his actions. The cultural backdrop of outlaw motorcycle gangs and substance abuse was central to understanding Hudson's motivations, but it did not excuse the harm inflicted on innocent bystanders. Friends and family of the victims spoke publicly about the long-term impacts. Douglas's permanent injury, Daley Holt's nerve damage, and DeWard's curtailed life of travel and adventure served as grim reminders of that morning's violence. The legal proceedings and media coverage brought intense scrutiny to the Hells Angels, revealing a lifestyle of loyalty, conflict, and extreme behavior. Hudson's path from gang member to convicted murderer highlights the lethal combination of unchecked aggression, substance abuse, and a violent peer culture. In the end, the story of Christopher Wayne Hudson is one of tragedy, not only for the lives taken and irreversibly changed, but also as a cautionary tale about the dangers of gang affiliation and the consequences of a moment of uncontrolled rage in a public setting. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps us bring more true crime stories and keep the community informed. Stay safe and see you in the next story.